Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Garrett Schmidt. I am the managing editor for BBC Exhibit Hall, and I'm glad to have you all here with us today. We have a live webinar that is hosted by CareSignal, which is a light beam company, and I'm really excited about it. It's called Bridging Two Worlds, Utilizing Remote Patient Monitoring to Succeed in Fee-for-Service and Position for Value-Based Care. I know that's a mouthful, but there is a lot here that I'm really excited to hear about, and I think we got a great presentation for you today. A couple items of housekeeping stuff before we get started. Everyone's joined today in listen-only mode, so you don't need to worry about muting your mic or anything. That's been done for you. We can't see your camera or anything like that. And during the webinar, we definitely want to hear from you, so please submit your questions at any time. We will have a Q&A at the end, but you don't need to wait until then in order to put your questions in. You should have a little control module that has a questions feature on it. So go ahead and ask your question there at any time. And then if we don't have time to get to it during the Q&A, we'll make sure to respond via email afterwards. So even if we're wrapping up and it's the last few seconds, go ahead and put that question in there. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded. So what I'm going to do is, after we're done, is I'll be sending everyone an email, probably later on this afternoon or even this evening, after everything gets processed and whatnot. And there'll be a link to where you can watch the recording, and then also where you can download the slides. And this way you can rewatch it or you can share it with colleagues, and we hope that you do. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today, who's Blake Margraf, who's the president and CEO of CareSignal. So welcome, Blake.
Thank you so much, Garrett. Really appreciate that introduction. And for everyone who's taken time today to join, thank you. I am also very excited about this discussion. We're going to dive right in here and focus on some of the trends around value-based care. And then I'll share a couple of specific examples, both technology and some cases, as to how organizations have juggled having one foot in each canoe. And of course, strategically, it would always be optimal to be fully in just one strategic swim lane, but that's not a financial possibility for most of us, most of the current partners that CareSignal serves. Before I dive in, I'll make one quick point of clarification or explanation. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see that I have the privilege of leading CareSignal, a light beam company. Today, we will focus mostly on the CareSignal deviceless remote monitoring offerings. However, we had the opportunity late last year, in late 2021, to join the leading population health company, Lightbeam. And together, Lightbeam and CareSignal have a combined offering that continues to grow by way of more acquisitions and product development to become the first true population health enablement company. So that's not the focus of today, but for individuals that are looking for clinical AI solutions, for robust population health, and of course, for scalable value-oriented remote monitoring, that is all part of the Lightbeam umbrella. Let me discuss a couple of best outcomes that we've put together, and hopefully we achieve all of these within the next 30 minutes or so that we can move into a question and answer session. First of all, I'd like to point out that it's not just finding the right patient populations, it's also pairing those populations with the right technologies in order to scale staff and scale the dollars that you're investing from a contractual and resource perspective and shifting to value. You're making these bets. To do that, you need to focus on the right patients. You need to use the right tools. As mentioned at the top, we'll move into some of the processes as well as some of the case studies, the real world outcomes that we've been able to generate through our successful partnership with organizations across the spectrum of value-based care. And even saying spectrum doesn't do it justice. Some groups are full capitation. Many serve, many IDNs serve MSSP ACOs, lots of MA lives, are contracted in narrow network equivalent type relationships with local self-insured employers where they have upside downside risk, and of course have plenty of fee-for-service out there. You know, it's still the case that for a lot of groups, the orthopedic service line is a major contributor to that EBITDA difference at the end of each year. Finally, challenges, opportunities, impacts, and you'll notice that I defined some of what CareSignal brings as a paradigm shift. Don't be scared. It is necessary, and I think you'll see that most of your investment and work is already advancing that paradigm shift, perhaps without you even realizing it. Anybody who's joined a previous webinar knows one of my favorite places to start is the current literature. I figure we all want to read the current literature. Not a lot of folks have time to skim through it, so consider this a quick opportunity. I'll summarize a few different publications that have come out recently, the first of which is focused on medical economics, and the takeaway here, bolded in the quote below, things are only speeding up, right? We're making progress more and more toward value-based care, and there are a couple of drivers of that. First, states, Texas, California, Florida are some of the highlighted states in this study, memory serves. And they're making investments on the Medicaid side. In fact, if you plot Medicaid spend per capita, it's finally catching up. You could argue that that there is some waste, but I would submit that especially with an increasing focus on social determinants of health, we're in the J-curve period, and there will be meaningful ROI because we're looking at the whole patient, not just someone who shows up to an emergency department once, gets you a couple of bucks, maybe, and then shows up again 6 months later. There's consumer demand. I think consumers have started hearing that for all the money that we spend on healthcare in the US, we're not getting the same value that counterparts in other countries around the world are getting. And that's not just the Western world, I'll point out. I would even cite the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's vision for 2030, which includes a major 15-point healthcare plan, as an extremely concise and compelling example of an area of innovation where the accountable care organization model will absolutely be applied, and I believe will be successful in serving a lot of beneficiaries that need it. And finally, even through the completely turbulent economic times, there's a lot of capital on the sidelines. And the reason that it's material for healthcare executives, clinicians to understand that is you should know that when you choose to partner with companies that are bluntly doing well themselves financially, that are at a level of maturity, that aren't throwing every single dollar at advertising, but are instead investing in product growth, in strategic partnerships, you are also choosing to invest in partners that will survive long-term in the industry. Of course, the reciprocal of that statement is buyer beware. If you work with groups that are the latest, coolest, most hyped thing, but that don't pass the leadership and technical tests when you do your diligence before partnering with them as a technology vendor, there's a risk there that you'll partner with a group that you then have to rip and replace in the next 18, 24 months. I'll hold off on naming names, but of course, glad to discuss with anybody who's making those decisions now. Next, a publication that reviews how and where to apply technology to achieve the best outcomes. And again, this is, if my math is right, 41 days old, so about as fresh as it can be. And makes sense, no surprises here. Avoid avoidable care. If it can be prevented without adversely affecting outcomes, do it. How do you do that? Focus on the right side of care. We see a lot of this with light beam client partners as well. A lot of groups want to boil the ocean, or on the other end of the spectrum, they want to just focus on the top 30 patients in their entire population. Neither of those is the right approach. What you need to do is figure out which sites and which rising risk populations are chewing up most of the dollars and nip that spend at the bud. On the downstream side, identify the right side of care. In fact, there are even tools such as Referral Point available in the market today to help make sure that that type of care is followed through by the patient. And then, of course, that ties into optimizing length of stay as well, focusing on the overall hospital readmission reduction initiatives. And let me share, this one is surprisingly old for my taste. It's about 3 months going on 3 months old. And this was striking to me, showing that in adjusted all-cause and avoidable acute care use for MA versus fee-for-service, there's just no question. There is strong reduction in global PMPM on a per capita analysis. So you're welcome to search for this. It's actually an entire open article, no need for any paywalls, and strongly recommend. This gave me great conviction that that there will continue to be a lot of investment in this area. Okay, let's take a step back and let me describe how and where CareSignal's solution fits. And before I can do that, we need to define the problem. And the problem in successfully bridging a shift from fee-for-service where more care is better, to value-based care, where less money spent for better outcomes is better. The challenge in bridging that gap is in scaling your resources and investments to a new pool of patients or members. That is the rising risk pool of patients. These are the folks represented as the bottom of the iceberg. And in this hotspotting study that I cite here, it was clearly demonstrated that not only was investment in the very highest risk individuals not positive ROI, it was at best break even, but that investment in rising risk was significantly positive ROI because you were able to prevent a material portion of that 20% of patients from bubbling up into high risk on any given year. And that comes at a time where this is not only a clinical imperative, not only a financial imperative, but I would submit a moral imperative, because we know that as nursing shortages continue and are projected to continue through 2030, we know that we are regressing on our previous investments and progress in health equity. And that health equity regression has been demonstrated in a number of cases, but in this study, one of my favorites, there was a 27% higher readmission rate in minority populations than white patients post-discharge during stroke discharges. And that's notable because the only thing that changed, this was a well-controlled study, the only thing that changed was the ratio of patients to each nurse. As soon as that fell, the readmission rates for white patients stayed about the same. The readmission rates for minority populations, in this case predominantly Black population, fell. Startling, unacceptable, and we can fix it. And the way that we can fix it is by embracing the paradigm shift. I warned you I was going to say that. And the paradigm shift is shifting away from a manual outbound model where cold calling is the name of the game to an inbound model, elevating our teammates to the top of license and making sure that when those care managers have conversations with patients, it's not only the right patient at the right time, but there is already data about that individual in place so that the conversation can be interventional in the right way. It's not, hey, Mrs. Smith, how are you doing? It's, Mrs. Smith, I noticed that you pointed out that your legs felt puffier than usual for the past couple days, and last night it looks like you were struggling for breath. I'd love to talk with you about that. What's going on? And to pull on that thread, we've seen real cases where Mrs. Smith had just called her daughter to ask her daughter to take her to the emergency department, and that as a result of that real-time intervention by a care manager, Mrs. Smith was able to have her Lasix titrated, feel comfortable with waiting a couple of hours, and avoid an $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 event. How? Ubiquitous, essentially the technological common denominator these days, text messages or phone calls. And of course, we go far beyond just one of those generic texts. Right off the bat, as I'll describe, every part of CareSignal is deeply evidence-based, clinically validated, but from a technology perspective, it is deeply accessible, all 4th to 6th grade reading levels, and in any language that makes sense, English and Spanish through to languages as obscure as Bosnian, and across a broad variety of different condition-specific programs that I'll show in just a moment. The engagement that keeps patients going for the long term is actually a result of proactive, predictive models that are able to anticipate when a patient will fall off and coordinate automatically with a real human call center that CareSignal runs to reach out to those people before they fall off. And that leads to at least 2 times and usually 5 to 10 times better long-term engagement than any comparable solution. I would point out as well, I take this for granted, but I know that in the industry, this is not always the case. Everything is white labeled. Your patients or members do not need another logo or brand in their life. These messages come not only on behalf of your organization, but on behalf of your care team or even specific care team members. And that means that the experience is highly continuous, is positive. And when you realize, of course, that CAPS is 4x weighted now, that matters more than ever before. Everything needs to flow together from the patient experience. CareSignal has also formed relationships with every major cell carrier, and that allows us to send and receive messages at no cost to individuals who would generally run out of minutes so many days into the months. And of course, running out of minutes, running out of texts, 6 of one, half of another, half dozen of another. And that opens up populations from a clinical impact perspective that have been traditionally completely off limits for care management initiatives. All right, I've foreshadowed this a couple of times. The CareSignal portfolio approach means that for the right population with the right condition, there is a program already built, already in place that will capture patient-reported symptomatology. For instance, for heart failure in the upper left, we might ask Mrs. Smith whether her legs feel puffier than usual, whether she's woke up at night struggling for breath. We're never going to say, hey, are you experiencing pedal edema? And how is that nocturnal dyspnea? Of course not. But the beauty of the portfolio approach is that we can go far beyond chronic conditions. We can move into areas that are subclinical, social determinants of health. We have an entire maternal health suite that was named by HIMSS the winner of an international search for maternal health solutions that advance health equity. We have a behavioral health suite, and I would highlight there an opioid suite that supports individuals that are still dependent and actively using, as well as individuals who are in recovery. And we have a program that helps support individuals to avoid them becoming dependent while they are rightfully prescribed opioids. And on, of course, screenings, each of which is, I mean, that category alone has a huge number of different programs and tools. And we continue to offer a no-cost COVID suite for community education and for staff burnout prevention and personal protective equipment access. I'm proud to say, happy to say that isn't needed as much as it was previously, given all the processes that have been stood up. But we rolled out that program within 2 weeks of the start of lockdown, and it's been used extensively across the United States, all completely at no cost to providers or patients. And it works really well. CareSignal, through collaborations with independent researchers, has published 13 peer-reviewed publications. And we've corroborated those academic publications in dozens of case studies and white papers with real claims analyses showing that not only do we drive clinical outcomes as described here, but those clinical outcomes lead to often even more impressive, frankly, financial returns. And that doesn't even take into account the staffing, scalability, and efficiency that our case studies show. Let me walk you through a few examples. I'm going to touch specifically on chronic care management as part of the focus of this webinar, given that that's a major fee-for-service opportunity, good old CPT 99490. And then we're going to move into some case studies and then move to Q&A. On the congestive heart failure side, as I've referenced a few times here, these questions are generated programmatically and sent out, and the patient understands that these questions are automated. And what we've seen is really interesting behavior. In fact, elderly patients using the phone call version of this, the touch tone interactive voice response phone call version, will wait by the phone for the phone to ring because they know that a couple times a week on certain days, they're going to get that question, and they really like providing their input. Patients also tend to use this as a warm line. This is a great way for individuals to raise a hand and throw up a flare saying, hey, something doesn't quite feel right. It usually is the symptomatology we ask about per the different heuristic, but it might be something else. And I'll get to this in a moment, but that is a powerful way to open up the 20-minute fee-for-service opportunity required for 99490, and of course the incremental time spent to have meaningful remote telephonic interventions with that patient without having to do any gray zone. Oh, sure, I reviewed that data. No, these are real conversations that lead to real outcomes improvements. COPD, very similar. This 62% reduction in hospitalization risk was actually versus a placebo control in a more than 160 patient prospective randomized controlled trial. Placebo control, no sugar pills. No, we just controlled for the Hawthorne effect, something that a lot of digital health solutions forget about conveniently when it's time to argue for their value. And 99% of you are familiar. The Hawthorne effect is, of course, the phenomenon wherein when patients are observed, they tend to get better. And that's not a reason to pay for technology, right? You want to pay for technology that drives those long-term outcomes, not that accidentally supports a population briefly. I referenced our social determinants of health in the context of a subclinical program set. This program itself comprises 11 different modules listed here some of which are listed here. And all of those modules longitudinally capture patient-reported outcomes, but in this case, the outcomes aren't biometrics. They're not even subjective or qualitative pain or something like that. These outcomes are social determinants of health risks that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. And yes, in theory, folks could go into my chart and they could send you a message saying, hey, I'm worried about my personal safety in my current situation, and I've also been hoping to find a way to get into a higher education program. And then in theory, you could connect that to a licensed clinical social worker somewhere in the organization. But theory, and soon not a lot happens. With this, things happen. Patients get the support they need. And we don't stop with just those trends. We always have an eye toward the future. An example is our long COVID program, which tracks symptomatology as well as mood, more symptomatology in the form of PHQ-4, to make sure that that individuals are able to get the support they need, be connected to the programs that could help them in the event that they are struggling with long COVID. And put all of that together, here is the flow. Lightbeam or another population health tool if you have one in place, but I would definitely vouch for Lightbeam. Lightbeam is able to create a targeted cohort, could be static or dynamically generated, especially if there's a post-discharge use case leveraging ADT feeds. That cohort is passed automatically to CareSignal, and this is where something different happens. Real humans reach out and have proactive telephonic conversations with the right patient to educate them about this new free program to help support X, their mood, their heart health, their risk of falls. Right? We even have a dedicated fall risk program. And then everything becomes automated, which is how we're able to deliver this program at such a compelling cost and strong value. And patients receive automated texts or phone calls asking them for a couple of pieces of data a few times a week. That could be more frequent or far less frequent depending on patient acuity. I did mention post-discharge. That is a very powerful use case as well. So we could have that as the trigger instead of other inclusion criteria. Only around 1% of patients that you see in the upper right in the red wind up requiring clinical support on a given day. And those individuals are passed either to one of your care management teammates or to a Lightbeam clinical services teammate, again, white labeled, operating on behalf of your organization, licensed in the appropriate state or states. Compact states definitely love those, but we can work with anyone. And the beauty of that is augmentation. You're short-staffed, your managers are tired. If you don't already have a robust team in place, we can help. We can help for the short term, we can help for the long term. This is not intended to be the major profit driver of CareSignal. This is simply a way to make sure that our clients succeed in helping their patients, and we succeed in driving ROI for our client partners. And of course, escalation to the appropriate provider site of care. Now, as mentioned, and we will have a case study coming out in just a matter of days here. So please, in fact, I'd make a note to my team. Let's please make sure that everybody that has taken the time to attend this webinar is on the first distribution list for our imminent case study. You know, the one that I'm talking about. And I'm sure, I don't know if I can announce the title and brand just yet. But this case study is a compelling overview of 4 different organizations, each of which is using CareSignal for some combination of fee-for-service and value-based care. And the way that they're doing this can range from, hey, they're all in on the ACO. It's finally time to take the infrastructure they used to use for fee-for-service and now apply it to a value-based care model, to, on the earlier side of the spectrum, leveraging this for chronic care management reimbursement. Again, this is a great way to bend the outcomes curve, but also surface opportunities to spend 20 very productive minutes and build that 99490 code to help achieve better outcomes. Another major benefit to the CareSignal process and option is because we support the enrollment, we can enroll patients in that chronic care management offering. So front desk teammates can focus on what their work already is, which is already plenty, and we can support that full end-to-end process. And on the top here, you see two quotes from 2 executives, one on the administrative, one on the clinical side, respectively. And those quotes speak to the real-time insights and data. I won't read them out loud. And fortunately, are also sentiments shared by the patients on the bottom. And I'd point out the one on the left here, where we see that patients appreciate the fact that the messages that go out to them don't feel judgmental. It doesn't feel like you're being asked to speak poorly about yourself, which is a major complaint, especially for behavioral health telephonic care. Those non-judgmental interactions via text, of course, can lead to really productive human-to-human conversations. Let me take just 2 slides and paint this in the broader picture of Lightbeam, just in case folks are interested in this as well. So Lightbeam, as mentioned, focuses on population health enablement. That starts by being the best at getting data and then making sure that those data are organized, actionable, and analyzed. Lightbeam pulls data from ADT feeds, post-adjudicated claims, HIEs, especially if there are really rigorous HIE collaborations going on in your geography, EHRs, and I think the best question that we can ever get is which ones? Because the answer is all of them. I've seen the list, and it's 2 columns of 11-point font that take up the entire slide. And that stems from the fact that the Lightbeam founding team previously founded NextGen and has deep EHR ties. Once those data have been taken in and ingested, they are all duplicates are removed, the data are normalized, attribution, heck, even making sure that the patients not only are on the right plan, but are still alive, takes place. And the data are then put into a secure, high trust and SOC 2 certified data warehouse where insights can be generated. And this is where the magic starts. Some folks attending might be aware that a couple of weeks ago, Lightbeam acquired Javion, the clinical AI and social determinants of health company. And that is part of the insight stack. And from the time that those insights are generated, all of those insights are then passed to a combination of engagement protocols, including CareSignal, so that scalable outreach can occur and we can actually bend the cost and clinical curves that matter most. Thinking about the value creation categories, Lightbeam would probably highlight 4 key categories. One is through a combination of care gap closure, HCC optimization, and ongoing analysis of opportunities, especially for full cap populations. We're going to optimize value, and part of that means optimizing quality scores. For groups that are focused on fee-for-service, there are plenty of processes in place to make sure that preventative programs are used, but in combination with the necessary revenue generators. Rigorous through plan attribution, rigorous opportunity identification for shared savings, and at the end of the day, doing what's right for our patients, reducing utilization wherever possible. In the interest of time, let me hop down here and speak to just a couple of the case studies, and I'm glad to speak to other areas as well. Here is a summary of one of the largest remote monitoring implementations in the United States, which was completely CareSignal. This was more than 35,000 patients across multiple states and 19 different condition-specific programs. Chronic conditions, behavioral health, maternal health suite, opioid support. And what we saw here is just highlighting the most commonly used programs: asthma, heart failure, COPD, diabetes, and then one called general medical, which is used as a blanket support, almost a digital foyer, if you subscribe to the digital front door model. And what we show is a more than $32 million reduction in avoidable utilizations. That's even before we factor in the financial value resulting from a dramatic 10x increase in staffing efficiency and scalability, and a hub and spoke model that allowed for top of license care where it didn't previously exist. We've seen the same thing in much more modest organizations. Here are some that I'm really proud to work with through a partnership with AmeriCares, where we were able to drive, actually, believe it or not, better clinical outcomes than those that we saw in our prospective randomized controlled trials. Here you see that for patients starting with an estimated A1C over 8%, a more than 1.8% reduction, and for patients with an A1C over 9% starting, a 2.5% reduction. And I think everybody knows exactly the paper that I'm referencing when I describe that chart that shows A1C reductions relative to starting, relative to baseline, and the dollar amounts associated with that on a time horizon of 12 or 18 months. These are not only material improvements in quality of life and in morbidity risk reduction, these are massive financial returns for patients that are traditionally overlooked. I mean, I'm proud here as well that this was a dramatic social determinants of health rollout. We were able to identify needs totaling over 2,000 across some of the most common drivers of poor outcomes that are all social, that are all subclinical. You see here helping people that were interested in employment connect with the appropriate resources. For those that suffered from food insecurity, the most common trigger that was raised, helping connect them with the appropriate resources locally. Think about the cost downstream that wasn't passed on perhaps to these organizations, but almost certainly to the emergency department and eventually to the taxpayer at a state and federal level, because we were able to support these individuals in a way that was respectful and timely. For groups on the phone or on the line that are multi-specialty large physician groups, where there's that true pride of ownership, you may already be familiar with a truly humblingly successful organization, ESSA Health, primarily Medicare Advantage focused. ESSA was able to define and then succeed in achieving 3 goals, I would say hypotheses, but of course the best outcome there is that you prove the null hypothesis, so disprove. So first was staffing efficiency, where we showed a 15-fold increase in the number of patients on the panel of the care manager, from 100 to 1,500. I could go more into how we did that. In the simplest sense, though, because of the paradigm shift with which we started, CareSignal was able to surface the right conversations at the right time. And that means that most patients are doing just fine, but when something starts to go sideways for one individual, they receive support exactly when they need it. Next, dramatic clinical improvements. And the ESSA team would be the first to tell you that they might have thought that they had squeezed all the blood out of this turnip. They already had an extremely high-performing population that was financially a success for the organization and for the physician stakeholders. And I'm proud that we were able to provide even more clinical and financial value for the patients, providers, respectively. And what that shook out to was an 11% reduction in global utilization. In other words, a PMPM savings of $124. You see that y-axis on the right side there. Our internal rule of all y-axes should be zeroed out. So whenever you see a bar chart, hop back up to this one. Whenever you see a bar chart with CareSignal, you know what you see is actually what you get. No misleading stuff there. And I was also proud of the qualitative relationship side, where the chief information officer, described this as the best implementation she had experienced and led during her time in health IT. I'm going to fast track down here and point out that one of the best ways, if you've heard this and you're thinking, well, that's cool, but what does this actually look like? Maybe you already have a CCM program in place. Maybe you're already struggling or focused on scaling your care management team to serve that quote unquote rising risk population. Well, why listen to me when you can experience it for yourself? The best way to do that is to go to try.caresignal.health, where you can play the role of both a patient and of a care coordinator serving that patient. And that try.caresignal.health site will give you the choice to play the role of actually 4 different patients across 4 different condition types, and you'll rapidly intuit exactly how everything comes together. All right. As promised, we are right on time. It's right at the 30-minute mark from the start. Garrett, I don't know if there are already any questions, but if there are, I jump at the chance to answer anything. Oops, Garrett, not sure if you can hear me.
Hi, Blake. I'll jump in for Garrett. It
Awesome.
seems like you might be having a difficulty. You did state, the first question that we have here is, you did state that CareSignal's work can be white labeled. Does that include physician groups and ACO names?
It does. Physician groups, ACO names. If you want to go to the provider level, we can go to that level. If you want to go to the care manager level, even more specific, then we can do that as well. And I would point out, I don't know if there are any payers attending now, but if there are, or payers watch this in the future, we can also work with you as a payer to figure out a unique program name that will be high credibility to engage your members, or we can work with you and your affiliated providers to figure out the best way to engage members in a way that is clinically trustworthy. And actually, Charlie, because we have the time, but because that's such a thoughtful question, here is an overview of the enrollment flow, one of the enrollment flows, very simplified, that CareSignal leverages to get the greatest possible activation, engagement, and long-term retention across a population. And it starts with multimedia outreach. Of course, we have a bit of a proprietary flow from a motivational psychology perspective. So this is intentionally very simplified, but leveraging all of the different outreach channels. And at every stage of our outreach, all white labeled. Here's an example of some of the materials that you could expect to see. So not only is everything out white labeled from the patient perspective, if they're scrolling through on their phone or opening up a letter in the mail when they walk to the mailbox, but all of those outreaches have an avenue for the patient or member to get started right away. Now, we don't expect any more than maybe a 0.5% conversion and activation from a mailer campaign. But when we do reach out via phone with that real human white labeled call center, that population is warmed up. They know to expect that that phone call is going to come, or at the very least, when someone on the phone mentions that they've received other materials, they know what that is. And we follow that up rapidly with a text. And then I mentioned this, but even after a patient has activated, we run predictive engagement algorithms in the back end to figure out who is at risk for not starting on the program, and then who is at risk for falling off of the program once they've started. And that leads to literally an order of magnitude better prevention, literally tenfold better prevention of drop-off than if we were to wait for individuals to attrit organically, naturally, and then try to pull them back onto the system. So I get genuinely excited here because this is, from a first principles perspective, you cannot support and improve health for patients that don't engage with the thing that supports and improves health. Your care management team can't scale if the technology that's supposed to help them scale doesn't actually meet patients where they are for the long term. So Charlie, I apologize to the individual who asked that question because they bit off more than they can chew with my answer, but thanks for asking.
Hey, sorry guys, I was had a little technical issue. Thanks, Charlie, for covering. We do have a couple more questions. Next question is, how many staff does it take to run this, and how frequently are the patients alerted?
Really good question. So the rough rule of thumb is one clinical one assigned person, could be a medical assistant, could be a nursing assistant, does not have to be an NP or anything by any sense. One person on the clinical side can usually support around 1,000, 1,200 patients, sometimes more, depending on how efficient the workflows are from a follow-up perspective. I would also point out that depending on the point of enrollment, for post-discharge, we might expect to see 55 to 60% of patients that are eligible actually start using CareSignal. So it's not as if 100% of eligible patients will go on to that individual's panel. And we have a staffing calculator that we can use to provide very accurate estimates as to what time will be required. Of course, all of the time required will be a dramatic increase in efficiency as well as top of license application over any existing human-driven outreach.
Great. Next question, we have a bunch coming in. By the way, if you do have a question that you would like to ask Blake, please go ahead and submit it using your module. It has the questions area. Just drop it in there for us, and we'll get to as many as we can. Next question is, we already have a device-based RPM program. How does this program fit in with the existing programs?
Yeah, great question. So for groups that already have a device-based program in place, CareSignal, think of CareSignal as the way to reach 10 times more patients than you already do. Device-based programs are great for very high acuity populations or for populations that are eligible for and you're actively succeeding in capturing not only RPM codes, which requires them to be firmly in the fee-for-service camp, but also enough time to make up for the upfront investment and legwork to roll out the devices. So put simply, in most of our partnerships, there is some level of alignment and complementarity with a device-based approach, but consistently CareSignal delivers 10+ fold more scale than any device-based program can from a logistics perspective.
Great. Next question is, would you talk about engagement rates and percentages you experience across MA and commercial patients?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the major factors is whether the patients are patients or members, which is to say whether this program is being delivered, offered through the payer or the provider. For the purposes of the question, I'll assume provider because the requester used patients. For commercial populations that are not post-discharge, so they're eligible simply because of maybe it's ICD-driven inclusion criteria, that will be one of the more challenging populations to engage and enroll. We would expect to see conservatively 15 to 20% activation from a list to full actives for that type of population. For a Medicare Advantage population that is post-discharge, that's the other side of the spectrum. So you'll notice I'm kind of rolling two factors together here in my 2x2 grid. In that case, we would expect to see upward of 55% from eligible to fully using CareSignal. And that will vary by condition. It will vary by exact contract type, age, demographics, but usually a good rule of thumb to be conservative is around 20 or 25% from an eligible list, global list, including bad phone numbers and all, through to active patients.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you. Next question, this may be a little bit more broad in scope, but how do you work with social determinants of health?
Sure. Yeah. No, not broad at all. Our social determinants of health offering has two components, and this actually has evolved even over the past couple of weeks. One component is the Javion-based social determinant of health offering, Javion Community. So for groups that are just starting to get involved in SDOH investment, this is a way for those groups to make a single investment and with minimal integration, get a blanket view of a block or sub-block level of what needs the population they serve will have. Incredibly powerful. Drop me a note. That's on the clinical AI side of the spectrum and specifically is SDOH focused. The CareSignal SDOH program, which I touched on just very briefly here, is more focused on longitudinal check-ins. So let's say that someone is at risk for housing insecurity. Well, periodically, a couple days before the end of the month, before rent is due, they would get a text. You know, Mr. Jones, how are you feeling about making this month's rent? And if that patient says, you know, they're at risk, then we will raise a flag to the appropriate member of the care team who can then spin that to an LCSW and follow the prescribed path. Yeah, I'd also point out that the SDOH program has a really wonderful warm line feature so that patients can text and connect at any time to start a dialogue about urgent needs that may have arisen between check-ins, because we don't bury these individuals with texts every day, right? These are coming periodically once or twice a month. And we also provide more frequent check-ins asking individuals how they're doing versus usual, better, the same, or worse. And we can define thresholds so that if patients say that they're doing worse than usual, that in itself is sufficient to trigger an alert under the standard operating procedure and hopefully figure out why they're feeling worse. Could be clinical, could be subclinical, but that's a really powerful way to get a foot in the door.
Very good, very good. And next question here is, do you have a care management platform and do you offer care management?
Aha. Yes and yes by virtue of Lightbeam. And this is when I mentioned population health enablement. This is so much more than just population health, meaning data, where you have to filter it and run SQL queries. Lightbeam has a robust care management platform, and as I briefly touched on, has a Lightbeam clinical services capability, so that our partners, if they don't already have the care management individuals in place, can still have a functional care management team while they spin that capability up.
Very good, very good. Well, I hate to do this, but we are actually running out of time here. And so unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. If you do have a final question, please go ahead and submit it. Like I said, we're going to get to as many of those through email afterwards as we can, and all of them. And but I wanted to, as we close out here, first of all, thank you, Blake. This was a wonderful presentation. I know personally got a lot out of it, and there's so much here. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be sending out to everyone a link afterwards to the slides, as well as to the recording to where you can watch it again, and hope that you do. But as we close out here, I wanted to encourage everyone to visit the virtual booth for CareSignal at VBC Exhibit Hall. And I believe we're going to pull that up here on the slide. There we go. So if you go to vbcexhibithall.com, and you'll actually be able to, it says Care Journey at the bottom. That's not right. But CareSignal, all the care companies, but CareSignal, you will be able to find their booth there, and that's a place where you can interact with them, learn more about their team and what they're doing, and there's just a lot of great resources there to find. And then lastly, if you'd like to get a hold of Blake or any of the CareSignal team, feel free to reach out to them. Let's see, yeah, there we go. Yeah, if you can see at the bottom here, there's Blake's email address, or you can reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to put you guys in touch as well. But I wanted to thank you all again for coming today. I know there's a lot going on with summertime and vying for your attention and whatnot, so I appreciate you spending the afternoon with us. Blake, again, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks, everybody.